come to ask me to marry you, haven't you?
I'm overwhelmed because you're like my favorite author of all time and you're actually standing here.
Welcome to Isabel Allende.
Thank you.
A dream weaver of stories, a conjurer of extraordinary worlds. It's really an honor to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
So you've said once that you can teach, you could teach somebody to write, but you can't teach storytelling, right? So what makes a great storyteller?
I think it's a good ear for stories. Some people have a good ear for music, and they can create music or play music. And some people have a good ear for jokes. Those guys that can tell a joke and have the sense of pause and they do it perfectly, I can't. But, and I can't even remember the jokes. But a story, when someone tells me something, it somehow gets ingrained in my brain and it stays there and it sort of ferments and eventually it comes out in some way. And I think that the whole secret of storytelling is to tell just enough to capture the reader or the audience's imagination and work with that. Don't give too much too soon. Wait. Dickens said, make them laugh, make them cry, but above all, make them wait.
And that teasing it out.
Yes.
Teasing it out.
Well, it's like, you know, in love.
Yes.
It's the same thing in love. You tease the guy, you tease him, and then at some point, you got him, you get
got
him.
him like in your trap.
When he's totally distracted, you get him.
So here's a memorable Allende quote. Nice people don't make interesting characters. They only make good former spouses. So I feel there's just a weight of worlds in that sentence. So can you explain what you were thinking when you said that?
Well, my stepfather always complained that he was never in my stories, but he has common sense. And a person with common sense is boring most of the time. So you want someone who is crazy, extreme, original in some way. And that's the kind of people that do not make good spouses or former spouses. You want someone with common sense for the former husband. I have several, so that's why I can't.
Yes, I know. You're quite an aficionado of former husbands.
Yeah.
So your first novel, The House of the Spirits, was published in 1982, and you were breaking into Latin America's very male-dominated literary world. You became a journalist before you were a novelist, and you've really remained sort of a woman of the arena ever since. You've had great confidence in your life to sort of keep driving forward. What gave you that confidence?
No, I didn't have any confidence. I was just desperate. I lived in a Catholic, patriarchal, authoritarian, conservative family in Chile. Can you imagine? It was like the Middle Ages. So just out of despair, I tried to get out of there and do something different. And I was, as a kid, I had this anger inside that I couldn't explain why I had it or what it was until I stumbled upon feminism. But that was in my late teens.
And that spoke to you and liberated you?
Yeah, I realized that I was not totally crazy, that there were other people like that in the world, and there was a language to express it and a movement and books written about it. I remember my mom. My mom she just died. My mother was a lady, an old-fashioned lady. And when I came up with these ideas of feminism, she said, I totally understand. I totally share your point of view. But can you do it discreetly? You don't have to be shouting. Don't tell people. And I said, but Mother, how are you going to change the world if you keep quiet? And she said, well, let other people do it.
And so your rebellion then you just decided to surge
I just
ahead.
couldn't stop myself.
You couldn't stop yourself. Your mother was very, very important to you, wasn't she? And
she was. She still is, actually.
She's still that, and she said that her mantra was just keep walking, nothing lasts forever, the nature of life is change. She was such a powerful presence in your life, and now that she's gone, can you talk to us a little bit about what she has meant to you?
Well, I lived separated from my mother most of my life. I was 15 when we were separated for the first time. And we seldom lived in the same continent, but we wrote to each other every day. At the beginning, letters would come in the mail, and she was living, for example, in Turkey in the 50s, 60s.
Because your father was a diplomat.
Yeah, and so the letters would take a month to arrive. So it wasn't a conversation, it was an ongoing monologue. But we kept writing, and then later they moved to Argentina, so the mail was a little faster, and then the faxes came out. And we started faxing each other like crazy because that was like a conversation. But we didn't know that faxes in time are totally blurred and erased, so we lost that period. And then we started emailing, and I have kept the first letters, the faxes, the emails for more than 40 years. And at the end of the year, I put them in a plastic box, mark the year, and it goes in a storage room. I have a storage room full of boxes, and each box has between 600 and 800 letters.
Wow.
So I have all of my mother's life in front of me, and she was 20 years older, so I could always see where I would be in 20 years. She was opening the way, showing me the way. Mm-hmm. And being a very different person from me, we got along. Maybe because we didn't live close.
Did she have
Yeah.
Did she have anything of your own literary gift? Was she a writer herself?
I think she would have been a wonderful writer if she would have been born later.
Yeah.
But in her generation, she was somebody's spouse.
Well, letters were also, have always been a very important thing in your life, and letters were also the basis for one of your most personal books, which I happen to love one of the most, Paula, it's called, when it's named for your daughter, who of course passed away at the age of 29 from a rare blood disorder. Many people really never recover from the loss of a child. How were you able to live through that devastating experience, and how did you find a way to survive the loss of Paula?
I never wanted to get over it, and I never wanted to forget what had happened or to, in a way, it's a sort of beautiful sadness that you always carry with you under the skin. And it's ready to emerge any minute. I see a young woman in jeans with a ponytail and a white linen shirt, and it's Paula. And so it comes and goes, but it makes me a better person, more patient and tolerant. And my mother said a couple of important things when Paula died. She said, as you mentioned, she said, this kind of grief you have to live it. There's no Prozac, no vacations in Hawaii, no therapy, nothing will help. You just have to go through it. It's a long and dark tunnel that you have to walk alone. Just keep walking. One day at a time, one step at a time, and you will find light at the end. I promise there is light, but it will take a while. And the other thing she said is, the worst already happened. Nothing else will happen in your life that will be even comparable. So if you survive this, you will survive anything. And she was right. Recently, well, not so recently, almost 3 years ago, I divorced my husband after 28 years of marriage. At the time, I was 72. So I thought, okay, the rest of my life I'm alone. And people were sort of telling me how horrible this was, why I had made this decision. Wasn't it better to just stay in something that wasn't that great, but it was worse to be alone? For me, it wasn't even 10% of what had happened before. I didn't even cry. So maybe I'm dry. I don't know what happened to me, but I thought it was a joyful experience, the divorce.
But in some ways, what you also are brilliant at doing is you kind of write your way out of tragedy, and you write your way through disaster. You sat down and you wrote this extraordinary, moving book, Paula, about your daughter.
Yeah, that was my way of walking the tunnel was word by word. And I picked up all the letters that I had written to my mother during the long year of Paula's agony, and I could read them in chronological order and realize what had happened and accept it and live with it.
Yeah.
So the book really helped me, but it also helped other people, because I wrote this book more than 20 years ago, and I still get letters from people who are either reading it now for the first time, or they read it a long time ago and something happens now that reminds them of the book. So I get the most touching, most wonderful letters.
Being in exile has been a very sort of formative thing, obviously, for you as a writer. And you fled Chile after your cousin Salvador Allende was toppled from the presidency in a coup, and you then lived in Venezuela in political exile, and you eventually moved to California. Do you think that experience of being sort of banished from your own home has been the key thing in your life?
One of the important crossroads, let's say. There are moments in my life when things have happened that are completely out of my control, that have sort of moved my life in an unexpected direction. I wouldn't be a writer today if I had not gone through the experience of being an exile, a political refugee, because I had to cut away from everything that was familiar and dear to me. No one does that just because. You do it because you're running for your life. So when I hear about all this rhetoric about refugees, it breaks my heart. People don't put themselves in the place of a person who is running away from everything they love because they're desperate, because they're running for their lives. So in my case, I think that I was almost paralyzed by a feeling of loss and nostalgia when I was living for the first few years in Venezuela, until I wrote The House of the Spirits, which was a crazy attempt to recover everything that I had lost, to put in that book everything. I think that Bertolt Brecht said in one occasion, "I am that man that carries around a brick to show the world how his house was." And in a way, I think The House of the Spirits was my brick, to tell the world, well, this is everything that was and isn't anymore. And that made me a writer, gave me a voice, and changed my life completely. So it wasn't all bad what happened. Right. And then I became an immigrant, and the experience is completely different. Because a refugee is someone who is always looking back, looking at the past, wanting to return. The average time a refugee spends away from their home is 17 years. By the time they can go back, their children won't, because they are already citizens of another place. So it's a very lonely and devastating experience. But I didn't go through that, because by the time I could return to Chile, I was an immigrant in the United States, because I had fallen in love with this man that I so happily divorced recently. So, what were we talking about?
So we were talking about being an immigrant. So the main character in your latest book, In the Midst of Winter, which I thoroughly recommend and which you can buy afterwards, which Isabel has kindly said she will sign, she's called Evelyn Ortega, and she's a young, undocumented immigrant in the US who's fled gang violence in Guatemala. It's extraordinarily vivid in the backtracking of her life. When you look at that immigrant caravan now that we keep hearing about, are you thinking about Evelyn Ortega?
Of course.
What are you thinking when you're looking at it?
I have a foundation that I created after my daughter died, because I wanted to do something to honor her. And the foundation works trying to help and empower women and girls. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we have been focusing on refugees, because it's a worldwide drama, tragedy that the world is living. And why is it a tragedy now that everybody's talking about it? Because for the first time, the refugees are knocking the doors of Europe. Refugees have been in the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, always. But now that they're coming to Europe, now it's a problem. And in the United States, we are talking about a caravan of families and people who are running away from the gangs, the narcos, corruption, extreme poverty, and all this is described in my book because it's one of the cases we have in the foundation. She's like one of the many refugees we know. So the tragedy is so difficult to describe without going overboard, because in literature, in fiction, the first duty of the writer is to make the story believable. Mm-hmm. And sometimes reality is not. And if I had described exactly what happened, how they killed the brothers, I would have turned away my readers. They would not have believed what the kind of violence and brutality that these people confront every day. So I had to tone it down. Isn't that awful?
That's incredible. That is incredible. That
yeah.
In fiction you had to make it more palatable.
More palatable so that people will believe that it is true.
Wow. Well, that's incredible, that piece of information. So you said that there are no indiscreet questions, only indiscreet answers, right? So that, of course, makes me ask you about your love life, because you give many teasers. Typical of the great storyteller, she's teased it out. Right? She's mentioning this divorce, which she's so happy about. She's teasing us to ask the killer question, right? Which is, tell us about the new man in your life, because
well,
it's a very romantic story, how you actually came together.
I tried Match.com, but actually, what can I write in my profile? 73-year-old short Latino grandmother looks for a partner? What would happen? What do you think? So it didn't work. I didn't get one reply, nothing. So I decided, okay, I'm going to live with my dog. I have a very cute dog. And I bought a very tiny house with one bedroom and a bed big enough for the dog and me. And I was very happy with that new situation. But apparently, I said this in NPR in some program, and a man who is a lawyer in New York was driving to Boston, and he heard me on the radio, and he didn't like what he heard. He thought, how come that this intelligent woman that wrote those books can say this stupid thing? I mean, she's really stupid. So he wrote to my office, and my assistant very kindly and very politely replied. And then he wrote again the next day, and then I picked up and I replied. And he started writing every single day, every morning, and every evening for 5 months.
Wow.
And the only person who has been so consistent in their writing is my mother. So I thought this guy must have some qualities of my mother. And after 5 months, I went for a gala of Planned Parenthood in New York, and I decided to meet him. I went with all my team, 7 people. And I said, okay, I'm going to meet this guy, so you disappear. I had some speech somewhere. So you disappear. There was a long stairway. And he was waiting for me downstairs, and the 7 members of my team were standing on the stairs with the phones, taking pictures. So it was a very humiliating moment. And the guy invited me out for lunch the next day. And I was sitting there in the restaurant thinking, what am I doing here? Tomorrow I have to go back to California. This is not leading anywhere. So I said, look, what are your intentions? Because I'm 73 years old, I don't have any time to waste. So he choked on the ravioli. And I felt so humiliated because I thought, okay, I got up and I left. But he caught me in the street. To make a long story short, he sold his house, gave away everything he had, all his possessions, except 2 bikes, some clothes, and for some reason, some crystal glasses. And he moved to my house. So now we are the dog, me and him in this tiny house with 1 bedroom. And it's really working beautifully. So my advice for the ladies in the room is that you always take the initiative. Always. Don't wait.
Mm. Well, I mean, I love this story because it's just about never losing sight of passion, however old you are. And one of the things that is so taboo in the United States, it seems, is for women to be able to age in public. You know, they have to conceal it, they have to deny it, they have to have plastic surgery, they have to pretend there's
Oh,
something.
I had plastic surgery.
When you have plastic surgery.
Yeah.
But why do you think America...
Do you think I would look this good without plastic surgery? No. Takes a lot of money.
A lot of money. So why do you think America has such a problem with aging?
I don't know, but it's a very
What's the
American
secret?
thing.
Tell us. I mean, you've obviously
in America,
beaten it.
you have to be successful, you have to be young, and if possible, you have to be thin.
But you've managed to beat this entire sort of cultural
No, I'm not
attitude.
fat.
You're not fat.
Yeah.
But you just have gone on, being yourself and meeting this fantastic guy and having this huge success. It's a great package, let's face it. I mean, you've managed to do it all.
Well, I've been very lucky. That's the truth. Because the guy could have been a serial killer. I mean, you never know. You never know. I have friends who have met serial killers, so it could have been my case. I was lucky.
So now the Me Too movement here in the US. I mean, what are your thoughts about that, about where that is going? And do you think that Me Too could ever finally obliterate the machismo culture of Latin America, and Central America, which is the most,
the worst in the world. I don't know if it's the worst in the world, but it's pretty bad.
I think the statistics are the worst in the world.
Pretty bad. Well, the Me Too movement, 2 weeks ago, I was with Anita Hill. And 25 years ago, the first person who denounced harassment in the workplace was Anita Hill. And she got all the aggression, and she was humiliated. And Clarence Thomas was elected appointed in the court. But what she planted, that seed, has been essential to support this movement and many other things that have happened because of that. Harassment in the workplace became an issue in the United States, even if she lost in that instance. And it extended to the world, to Chile, to every other country. People talked about it for the first time. And the same thing is happening today with the Me Too movement. Whatever is achieved is a seed that is planted and will germinate in time. And I think that now it takes less time because communication is so much better. We are better informed and connected than we were 25 years ago.
Well, in your book, Paula, you talk about having an experience with a fisherman when I think you were 8 years old.
Yeah, but that was different from this, because that was... I think that the Me Too movement and what happened to Anita Hill is worse because it's a person in power who takes advantage of someone who doesn't have the power to defend herself. In my case, it was a fluke. I was a child, and I was almost raped by a fisherman. He wasn't in a position of power. He was a poor guy, uneducated, who just tried to do something that was... He would have lost his freedom if he would have been caught. Or if my grandfather would have caught him, he would have killed him. But it's not the same with people who are working for someone and are subjected to that.
Do you feel that it could make a difference at some point in your, in
Chile? It's very powerful. It has really picked up the Me Too movement, and especially among young women. And it is, as I said, extended. It's happening in many places. And of course, when I was young and I was fighting for feminism, I thought that it was such a rational, fair struggle that in a matter of a decade, maybe 10 years max, the world would have changed. We would have ended the patriarchy. Everything would have changed. And look, more than 50 years have gone by and we are still there, but things have progressed. It's not the same world.
Well, your books have been translated into 42 languages and sold almost 71 million copies. And every January the 8th, you start writing a new book. Can you tell us what the next book is about? Or?
I don't have a next book. Do you have any idea? We're already in November, for God's sake.
But this happens every single year.
No, some years I do have some idea, and then I start researching. And for this book, in the midst of winter, I didn't have an idea in December, and we had rented a house, a brownstone, in Brooklyn. And then I didn't have any ideas, and people started giving me ideas, and that's how the book came to be. So if you have any ideas,
So what's the story that
speak
you...
up.
What is the story you most want to tell that you haven't told?
I would like to tell that my mother's story. I promised her I wouldn't. But I might break the promise because she's not here anymore. I have to
And
wait.
you have all those boxes.
Yeah, I have the boxes, and I have to wait until my stepfather dies. I'm counting the days. He's 102. He's 102, and he may live like 5 more years. So
You'll get to it.
yeah,
I have absolutely no doubt.
I always said that I would write an erotic novel after my mother died because that would have killed her. But now I'm too old.
Now you're living an erotic novel, so what does it matter?
You wish.
So,
You wish.
okay. Isabel Allende, you are an amazing and fabulous
Thank
woman.
you.
And I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, my God.
Thank you.